near to 8 o'clock UK time. There are some protocols. Just to let you know, there will be some group discussion at the end of each session. Use the hand to indicate if you'd like to speak and turn the microphone off unless you are speaking. But first, some scene setting words from me. I remember in late March this year, as the virus was just starting to influence decision making, including the suspension of our first RIG meeting of the year, which had been scheduled for the 19th of March. I was being contacted with messages such as, I'm a member of a multi-academy trust. I've just been told the governing board isn't going to meet because of the COVID-19 crisis. What shall I do? Or, I'm a clerk to a college governing board. The chair is going into shielding and I'm going to stop governing board meetings for the foreseeable future. Is that okay? And yet, in recent weeks, I've been enjoying hearing from governors about how they've been fulfilling their governing responsibilities through Zoom, Teams, etc. And indeed, many governors have been describing to me the important working together ethos that's developed through senior leadership and governor interactions, both formally and informally during the lockdown weeks. It seems to me that if ever there was a time for governors and governing to play a part in education institutional leadership, it has been in the recent lockdown weeks. So I hope that introduction forms a useful link to the first presenter, Julia Skinner, who will talk to you on the theme of the importance of governance at a time of crisis. Over to you, Julia.
I need to show my screen. Lizana, can you?
So Julia, you now have hosting powers, so you can just upload it.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this RIG Zoom meeting on governance. And it's my privilege to start the ball rolling by setting a bit of a scene. I'm a retired head teacher and governor at a number of schools and have supported both MATs and mainstream schools. When Gavin Williamson announced on the 18th of March that schools were to close on the 20th, I think there was, to put it mildly, a bit of a panic across our schools. Although it had been expected, to be given 2 days' notice was a bit of a big ask. Of course, we know that schools were not closed. I get very cross when the implication is that they were closed. Those children whose parents were on the key worker list and those children considered vulnerable were encouraged to attend school, which meant for some institutions that could be around 100 pupils, whilst for others it could just be 1 or 2. With all the preparations that had to be made, like making sure free school meal children were being fed and that staff who should be shielding were actually shielding, you might assume that governance would be the last thing on the many lists that head teachers were constructing. Actually, a number of governing boards did continue to meet and played a very important and are continuing to play a very important part in the crisis. However, it was odd. For the largest team of volunteers who we're used to going into school in person, it did feel very scary and completely odd. How were we going to support schools when we couldn't go and visit? How could we not hold a meeting? And if we were able to do a virtual meeting, what would we actually discuss? I'm going to show you, hopefully, in just a few minutes, that actually governance does have a place in a crisis. For me, when things are stressful and you don't know where to start, going back to the beginning and reminding ourselves of what our role is can help. The governing board has 3 core functions, although I'm going to suggest a possible 4th later. The role of the board is strategic, not operational. That is the mantra of governance. Everybody knows that. But is that the same in a crisis? The 3 core functions are shown here. They form part of the toolkit that all governors should know, and we're all introduced to it, certainly at induction. But when you read them, they do feel very strategic, very formal, and, well, really quite away from a crisis. For instance, will we be thinking about the vision, ethos, or strategic direction? Isn't that something that we do at the beginning of the school year? Surely we need to start being practical. And for the second one, how will we hold leaders to account on performance when everything has been put on hold? And for the final function, will there actually be any need for us to look at all those spreadsheets? The definition of a crisis is, can be quite a personal one. I have some governors who probably have a crisis on most meetings, but I thought it would be useful just to have a look at some official definitions. If we look at the first one, as we know, the economy has been hit very hard. And for some schools, they did have to consider spending during the lockdown for PPE, and for some, how they were going, actually feeding children. The second one, obviously key decisions did have to be taken, and I would hope that the board were part of those decisions. And then for the final one, I think we'll all agree that closing schools did indicate a major change. After all, that only happens when it snows, doesn't it? So what would those 3 functions actually look like in a crisis? What would a governing board do? If we look at the first one, the vision, ethos, and strategic direction of the school is all about how it works, its philosophy. And one of the most important aspects of a school's ethos is to support all its community. As I've mentioned, governance is not about being operational, but certainly at the beginning of lockdown, so many of the operational considerations that senior leaders had to take could have been a matter of life or death if they hadn't been done properly. So it's vital that the governing board did understand those decisions and continues to support the school team. In academies, the responsibility sits with the trust board, while for maintained schools, it is the local authority. But in a crisis, I believe and put to you, it is ethically and morally important for the board to understand the why of the decisions. And for senior leaders, having that sounding board for their decisions is a key to their well-being, because many of our heads have really felt the weight of those decisions. As you can see, there's a list there of things that were discussed, which children were coming into school. Schools are used to having a risk assessment, but this is a COVID risk assessment. This was different. And obviously safeguarding and health and safety are things that governors are used to doing. But again, these needed to have a COVID element to them. And possibly more important than ever was the well-being of staff, and is the well-being of our leaders. For our second function, the holding educational leaders to account, this function's all about standards. And in this crisis, we haven't been able to test children, especially if they've not been in school. But for some governors, they're going to feel a bit lost without data. But it is still important for the board to understand what learning, if any, has been happening and how successful it's been. Performance management has had to be suspended, obviously, but it will need to be replaced. A discussion will need to take place once things can get down to being settled. And the final function, the one about finance, which many of us are nervous about, the financial health of an organisation should always be considered, whatever's happening in the world. And for business managers, having that objective eye on their work from the finance committee, still following the normal timetable is really key. Budgets still have to be set and agreed. Checks have to be made on any additional expenses incurred during the crisis. And unfortunately, it is at times like a pandemic that fraudsters will see their opportunity. So the external eye of governors must be maintained. I mentioned a fourth function, and you can see it here, and it's one being put forward. It's been around for a while from the National Association of Governance. It's been pushing for this fourth function, and it concerns stakeholders. And obviously, in a crisis, they should be uppermost in the school's mind. And stakeholders will include the pupils, parents, staff, support staff, and also other providers who may be relying on the school for their business and their livelihoods. And the role that the board can play and have played is in the communications. As we've seen with much of the guidance from the government, if it is not clear, if it is muddled, stress, anxiety, and a lack of confidence occurs. For all stakeholder groups, what was happening in their lives during lockdown would have been scary and very unknown. The key worker list was set, but the definition of vulnerable could be open to interpretation. Some parents were anxious about their children not getting a place at school. And at the beginning of the closures, and I suspect now as well, head teachers had to run the gauntlet of parents' anger. The board being part of the communicating with parents, backed by a full understanding and agreement of the reasons behind the decisions, is always helpful, but particularly at times of crisis. So for me, the governing board and governance is the umbrella. It protects the school, it protects the organisation. The handle keeps it separate so that the work can be done, but whether it's fine or whether it's stormy, the governance is there to make sure that things are protected. We're now going to go into rooms, which is very exciting, my first experience, and I put there a few questions you might like to consider in your groups. So what role did the board play? Does the board continue to play? Did it provide support and confidence? And how do you know?
Great, thank you, Julia. I'm just about to put people in rooms. Julia, if you could just unshare your slideshow for me, that'd be great. Thank you. Then you will be moved into breakout rooms for within 15 seconds. If you could just click on the link, then it will take you there. And when I return you back to the room, it will give you about 60 seconds to return back into the main room after the 5 minutes discussion time. And we're about to go.
Oh,
It's nice to see everyone back. People are starting to drop in.
Quite a journey, that. Yeah. Are we
20
staying?
seconds, there we
Are we staying in the same groups, Lizana, for future?
I'm
Or-
going to try and keep it in the same groups if I can, but the system randomly selects, so it moves you into your groups.
Mm.
We're nearly there. 5 seconds, and everyone should drop in.
excellent.
Oh, nearly here. Fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone. Julia, back to you to just facilitate the conversation, and hopefully each group have got someone who can feed back to us as well.
Yes, thank you very much. Our discussion really, we all shared what our experience has been during lockdown and continues to be. We agreed that governance was school governance was very important at a time of crisis, and Chris made the point that in a way it was business as usual, but not business as usual. And he's interested to hear what it was that we did that was different because it was a crisis. But I'm very, very pleased to say that people in my room, they've all had a really good experience. Had a head teacher, Derek, felt very, no, not Derek, Alex, who felt very supported by his board, and Jill has continued to evaluate her board on how they're doing. So it does seem to have been a really good experience for everybody.
Super, thanks for sharing, Julia. It might well be that there are colleagues from room 1, 2, 3, and 4 who would like to share as well. Rowan?
Shall I go in? Yep. Well, we heard across governing experience from schools, further education, and higher education, and all highly positive. I think one of the interesting things that emerged was the benefit of online operating does give more of a focus. It encourages just making sure the business is clear and making sure the business is done. And I think one of the things that maybe that follows on from the recent experience, recent weeks of experience, may well be trying to take that approach to governing into the future and making the best of that. But I think the positivity and the creativity around governing practices across those the 3 sectors were very interesting to hear about. Okay, Lizana, back to you.
Lovely. Anyone else? Anyone from room 2? I know it's Bee's room, for example, and Claire and Ian.
Well, yes, I'm happy to say a few things about. Oh, sorry, is that 2 of us speaking at once? Just a few things that came out of our discussion was there's a range of different experiences in terms of the type of governance role. So there's governance in multi-academy trust, both at local level and board level, governance in maintained schools. And so the theme, which has been quite prominent in governance over the last few years, where we have discussions about where the power lies and communication between different levels of governance in organisations where there are multiple levels of governance. That's really come to the fore, not always in positive ways, I think, in some of the experience we had in our room during the pandemic.
Lovely, thank you for sharing. Really interesting points. So anyone from room 3 by any chance keen to contribute? It's Noreen's room.
Yeah. We discussed about how important communication was, and the difficulty that because it was there were ever-changing plans and ever-changing things happening, so that made communication difficult. One point which came up was, do parent governors find it more difficult to stay strategic while governing in a crisis because of having their own child in that crisis situation?
Interesting point. Thank you for sharing that. And then we have Deb's room as well.
So we had a really interesting discussion about the variance of governing boards and MAT boards and where they're at the moment and how much information is and isn't being fed back to them. So really contrasting views actually in situations. And Colin made an interesting point about how online technology, and lots of us, you know, I was just dropping a note to Chris in the chat saying it was great to actually be at a governance and governing rig for a change and actually be able to join you. So the speed and some of the good things about our Zooming and our Teams meetings that we've all been having over the last 3 months, actually in a situation Colin had been in, it had a sterile effect and wasn't kind of leading to that kind of informal discussion and that helping schools along the way. So I thought that was a really, really interesting point.
Lovely. Thanks for sharing, Deb. And then I think Julia's group did contribute, and we also heard from Ron's group, so that's fantastic. Thank you everyone for your contributions. Really great to hear your thoughts on this. And as a governor myself, I also agree it's been quite challenging, but also creative and interesting. Now it gives me great pleasure to welcome our next speaker, Derek Boyle. Derek is going to talk to us about the importance of maintaining a strong relationship with senior leaders as a governing body. So Derek, I am handing over the hosting to you.
Thank you very much.
And then you can share your notes.
Right, well, good evening, colleagues. My current role, I run a school-centred ITT provision in South East London in Bromley. And my governance structure at the moment is that I have a board of 12 head teachers, which are my governors, which has its own issues. Prior to that, I was an assistant head teacher for 5 years at a school in Tunbridge. And part of my role as one of the assistant head teachers is I had some link governors that I worked with on a regular annual basis, and they had overview of the 2 communities which I used to look after. We had 4 communities within the school, so I had on an operational role, I looked after 600 teenage and wannabe teenage girls every day. The link governors I worked with were linked to the communities, but also the departments I line managed, because it was almost a school within a school type structure. So within that, the school governors which I worked with, we've covered these 3 points already about accountability, the role of school governors within the school structure. But when that broke down from the original sort of yearly improvement plan, then accountabilities to each of the assistant heads, and then within that, we then started a conversation on an annual basis of review and accountability with our link governors that we worked with. So one of the main points of influence as an assistant head teacher I had when I worked with my link governors was the ability to influence governors and build those strong bonds between us as a leadership team and myself and the other team of assistant heads with governors which may sit on the resources committee, may be sitting on the appointments committee when they're setting budgets. And as the assistant head leading back those particular communities, it gave me an opportunity to almost lobby and to show and to push to the front with those governors why it was important that the business studies department, when they're looking at for refurbishment of a room, if the link governors have actually spent time in the business studies department with the teachers, with the A-level students, with the GCSE students, it gives an opportunity for them to understand the contextual impact of the decisions which are made behind closed doors in the governors' meetings. The working relationship which, as an assistant head teacher, you build with the governors, it takes nurturing, and it's nurturing over a long period of time, because where governors have their terms of office, what we try to do is make sure when there was a rollover of governors, we didn't lose all of the governors from each of the communities at times. So you still had a corporate knowledge within that group of 3 or 4 link governors that we worked with. And it was important to have dialogue, not just in the formal meetings you have with the governors, but you always made sure you made a point of talking to them at the Christmas fair, at when we had the carol concert. You made a point, because as an assistant head teacher, you are an ambassador for the pupils and the staff within the school that you are representing. And it is a long-term relationship, because where you have a changeover of governors, as the assistant head teacher with the strategic responsibility for a part of the school, you are providing that community, that continuity going forwards. So my link governors, we had pastoral link governors, so they looked after 2 of the 4 communities within the school. I also had an SEND link governor as well, and we had a pupil premium link governors as well within the school. And the governors also, within those communities, we had several departments. So we had science, business studies, we had childcare, health and social care. And so all of the form tutors for that community also came from within those departments as well. So you really had a school within a school type approach. And so the 5 years when I was in post, we was able to build up a really good relationship with our governors, and they also held us to account, because by holding us to account and said that last year you said to us this was going to happen, how did you implement that? That was one of the things which was nice, to have that ongoing relationship with them. So at the school I worked at, we had our team of link governors, and we had an annual process. So in the autumn term, we were implementing the school's improvement plan. So the areas which I was responsible for strategically, and also with my departments, we had a planning meeting at the end of the summer term to set the context, and then the autumn term, when we were able to discuss about the GCSE and the A-level results and the BTEC results, etc. We then had a cross-cutting conversation with them, saying, right, if the results in business studies this year are up, what were the contributing factors? And they really wanted to get into the forensic side of it, of holding us to account. If it was, for example, we had a new member of staff in, they'd had a big influence on the results which came in, they wanted to meet that member of staff. And most of it was to say thank you, or to say, well, what could we do to support you going forward? What can we do to help you sustain those improvements? Is it resources? Is it in terms of timetable allocations that we can be talking to? So this is a diagram showing the visit process. So if we start up at the top with a whole school objective, so coming from the improvement plan, the development plan and targets linked to we suggested some foci for the link governor visits. We then have a scoping meeting, and that scoping meeting would take probably about 2 hours. We would go through and we'd look at the format for the visit. Who do they want to see? Why do they want to see them? And we also, if there were cross-cutting issues that they wanted to look at, whether that are drawing other members of SLT as well. We looked at the logistics, and what we did actually on the logistics for the visits, we briefed all of the stakeholders within our communities that we worked in. But I also made sure that my student leadership team, so from within the prefect team, all the way through to the year 7 sort of school council reps, they helped me planning the visit, because I also asked them, who do you think the governors should be talking to? So we always had a student panel, we always had a staff panel. We also made sure that the governors had time to sit and meet with the pupils at break time, with refreshment. So the pupils all wanted to be on the visit day, because they know they had a nice lunch laid on and they got the chance to chat to some of our lovely governors. So when I first started there, we had a single visit day, but the process evolved over the 5 years I was in post that we actually had a visit day in the autumn, which was normally sort of end of October, beginning of November, and then they would come back in March. And so on that second, we'd have the same group of governors come in, and they would also say to us, well, in the last visit, we saw this really good practice, so we wanted to follow up on this. What progress has been made? And so that gave me an opportunity to feed back to them about what things we'd been putting in place in year. As well as the interim report, we then wrote a final report, and I wrote the outline draft of it. That it then went to the governors for them to add their part, and then we also added in feedback from the student leadership team, which we had within the two communities. So that report was then shared with the governors. It was shared with all of the teaching staff within the communities that I looked after, and it was also shared with the student leadership team, and then it was shared with all the form tutors so they could share it with the children within the school as well. So it was a top to bottom review of what we were doing, and we needed to make sure that all stakeholders were included in that process. We then had a reflection meeting. So myself as SLT and my middle leadership team and my form tutors, we then had a separate meeting and goes, right, this is what the governors notice is working really, really well. These are the things which they're asking questions about. And that's the way that they phrased it. These are things we'd like to ask questions about. Not, we don't agree with the way you're doing that, because that was the operational implementation of the school policies and the school improvement plan. But that did impact on the review of our whole school development plan. And from that, it enabled us to input that into the annual review cycle. And with the advantage of having governors year on year in the same community, you had a community-based narrative within our SLT. So that strong relationship between governors and SLT members, it takes years to develop. It's not something which you can run in one meeting and go, yeah, we're all on the same page. And because the members of SLT will give the governors what they want to hear. If governors want to get underneath that, it's about building up trust on both sides, that you are not going to be letting the side down if you let the governors know something. Clear understanding of the scope of the responsibilities of each party, even down to if a governor can't make it on a particular visit day, what do? Do you rearrange it for the whole day? But then you've got probably 12 to 15 people which have been tied up in those days. The conversations were very solutions focused, and we always use the language of we, because the governors saw themselves and me as the community leader and the heads of department and the pupils and the teachers and the support staff as a community, and it was something we're doing together. So we use a lot of we within what we were doing. No assumptions and prejudice. The first time I went into assistant head teacher's role, it was very much, am I going to let the side down? Am I going to get caught out? And do these people know what they're talking about when they're coming in? They're coming in to look at us. When you get past that defensive mindset and you are working in a more of an adult or an adult state rather than a child or parent state, it gives an opportunity where you can actually take a step back as a member of SLT and go, actually, I feel comfortable talking to governors because it is a partnership between us. And so I know I've been rambling for a little bit, but this is a question which I'd like to pose to everyone, is about how can we facilitate a productive partnership between members of SLT and governors? Because I've seen it from the SLT side, but how do you as governors develop that relationship between yourselves and also the members of SLT within the school, so it's not just dealing with the head teacher all the time? Okay, thank you very much. Now I'm going to hand back to Lizana, if I can remember.
Great, thank you, Derek. Fantastic. So with those questions in mind, we are going to move back into our meeting groups. Hopefully you will be in the same group again, and then we will spend 5 minutes discussing the questions. I will call you back to the main room, and if you can have a representative for each of those groups to share, that'd be fantastic. Thank you. Hi, Noreen.
Hi.
Are you okay?
Yes, fine, thank you.
Brilliant.
It came up to leave, so I've clicked that.
Yep. If it does do that, you can still stay
Yeah.
in the room for another 60 seconds.
Oh, right. Okay.
And then it will drop you back into the main room.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought I had to click.
That's okay. That's all right. Super. I think people will be joining us in 12 seconds.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Everyone's back. Fantastic. I'm going to hand over to Derek to facilitate the conversations and Ron as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. The room which I was in, we were talking very much about the importance of relationships, but also where you've got to be careful, particularly with some of the comments from the crisis about leadership in a crisis, is that have a clear shared focus on what you're doing, and it doesn't just become sort of what like the head teacher with the chair of governors. Got to include everyone else, all of the other stakeholders, to make sure that that shared vision and challenge and okay, there is a problem over there, what are we going to be doing about it? And that was the last thing that Chris pulled together. So I think we're in room 5. So
should we go 1? Do you want to go room 1?
Yeah.
What
Room
Craig from room 1 I think is going to provide the feedback.
thank you.
It's room 1 and not 101, I hasten to add. But, about productive partnerships then. Opened up with about the need to engage as with governors as almost free consultants, particularly when there's professional background, and feedback where progress has been made or indeed where things can't be done. And then there was a very relevant counter comment to that in terms of that's got to be built on relationship building and understanding governors' backgrounds and interests, probably appropriate. Then we talked about trying to have that productive partnership with the principal, as it were, and the head, who in some cases can almost police access to further detail and to other members of the management team. We need to figure out a way around that in some respects, or with or through, if need be, because governance should feel comfortable, whilst respecting the boundaries of management, be able to have a drill down conversation and get access to information on an open and transparent basis. Then we welcome the deliberations on the collaboration-based focused for visits and the link governor that we took as part of the presentation, and we saw those as moving on beyond being a token visit and forced, and really welcoming governors in as critical friends. And I think first and foremost it should be friend and then critical, because it's easier to work with friends if you've got the trust and the relationship in place. And then Ron very usefully raised his previous research on the perception of governance at the management level, and quite interesting feedback on the level of understanding. And perhaps we should not, perhaps we should keep that in mind in some respects, and not let that go as an assumption that people in schools or colleges or wherever, as teachers and lecturers or as management, understand the function of governance. And how do we break that barrier down? And it's easily done if basically there's a dialogue, talk to people, you know, get access and expose. Governors should feel comfortable in walking in and wearing that badge of honour in some respects. In one of my own places, we had the governance as part of the staff development day, and we had a workshop on it, and everybody was welcome. And I brought some governors in, and we explained things and had a dialogue. And it makes things easier if you can get them in and just engage with your educational community. And that concludes the voting for Yorkshire.
Thank you. Next room, room 2.
Did you want to go this time, Claire, so I don't hog the limelight?
Yeah, no problem. Sorry, I'm trying to stay on mute for as long as possible because I have a baby in the room next to me. It is my baby, so I am aware of the baby, said baby, but if you hear a squeal every now and again, I apologise. Yes, so Ian and I had a chat about the relationship sort of I was able to bring in some of my experience. So I'm chair of a small maintaining school, but also work with a number of multi-academy trusts, and then obviously Ian from his role in an ex officio position on a multi-academy trust. I think we both agreed that there's been a very supportive role. I think sort of if we were to weigh up support versus challenge, there's definitely been more support in this position, but obviously everybody's learning at a very fast pace at this moment in time, and governors are still and trustees are still very much volunteers, so they have their own personal issues to deal with, whether it be professional, whether it be home life, so their capability to learn quite as quickly in this situation possibly might not have allowed for as much challenge. It's obviously a lot easier to challenge when you're fully aware of everything that's going on around. So we feel like there's been a very supportive environment for most trustees and governing bodies, which has been great. A strong focus on risk assessments, I'm sure, as everybody will have found. And we hope that won't upset the balance moving forward. I think was the discussion that we had, is that we'll have to be very, very, very careful to make sure that moving forward that there is still a very even balance of support and challenge, and that the current situation doesn't drive forward a change that may have an impact on governing bodies moving forward. I don't know if you want to add anything else, Ian.
I think that summarises it perfectly. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Right. Room 3? Or was that room 3? Room 4?
Yes, we had an interesting discussion based around similar things actually, but particularly the shared values. So not quite necessarily the vision or the challenge, but making sure that the values that are there rooted at the beginning, that we talked about transparency associated with those values. And we talked about B. Hughes's article. I don't know if anybody else has seen that. It was in the latest copy of Email. It was about the roles of different types of CEOs, and she's written a really interesting thesis there at Manchester about the different molds that these CEOs potentially fall into. I am intrigued not there, then clearly that's more difficult, and so we did talk about that a bit too, but that was it really.
Okay, thank you very much. Have we heard back from all rooms?
I think we still need to hear from room 3, Derek.
Room 3, sorry.
Okay.
Well, we had a discussion about in order to build relationships, the most vital thing is trust, and secondly, both sides understanding their respective roles. We had an example of good practice where this helps is the link governor elects areas to work in, and that's based on their own interest, and because they're interested in that area, they love going in and talking to the respective staff members. And the question raised was, does trust come with time? So if there's a new governor, new on the board, has just joined the board and becomes a link governor, will they take more time to develop a trusting relationship with their respective SLT than somebody who's been there for a long time? So maybe new governors, there's something to think about. How do we help new governors develop that trusting relationship when they are new to the board, new to the school?
Yeah, what we've found in the relationship I was in is that when the new governors came in, they came into an existing team of link governors, and so you always had that existing trust, which almost by osmosis that the new governor can see how it modelled with the other governors and also the SLT they're working with. Okay. Thank you very much. I'll hand back to Lizana now. Okay.
I think it's time, actually. Is it time to move on to Maureen and your presentation? And that's titled The Importance of Accountability and the Governor's Role. So accountability, Noreen,
Yeah.
over to you.
Right, so I'm Noreen Khalid. I'm a trustee as well as chair of 2 local governing bodies. And I'll be talking about accountability and the governor's role, especially during the crisis. We've already heard Julia talk about the 3 core functions of the governing bodies. And my talk is more about the second one, which is holding school leaders to account. And what does that look like nowadays during this period of crisis? Governance, as we know, is a fine balance between challenge and support. There is a feeling that right now, because of the crisis, because of the stress the school leaders are under, maybe the support should be slightly more and challenge slightly less. But there's a danger to this. If we tilt the balance too much towards support, the danger is we lose the challenge completely. And which means there are no questions asked, which means there's no governance happening. So that is, although yes, support the school leaders because it's such a stressful time, but remember that governance does need to continue happening. So do continue having your governing body meetings, do continue asking questions and challenging the school leaders. So accountability during crisis. A few things which I thought are really important.
Sorry to interrupt. We can't see your slides. Would you like me to project them for you?
Yes, please. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Should I stop sharing?
That's fine. I'm just taking over. There you go. Super apologies to interrupt.
That's okay. It's good.
Right, okay.
So slide number yeah.
This one? Okay.
Yeah, that's fine. So challenge and support. Although they need to be balanced right now, there is a feeling that there should be more support and less challenge. But the danger of that is, next slide. Lizanne, if you could go to the next slide, Lizanne. Yes, that danger is no governance. So I've thought about some of the things which we should be challenging school leaders at the minute, and the first one is safeguarding. Now, because schools are operating in a different environment at the minute, so therefore safeguarding, we still need to have a look at safeguarding. Lizanna, could we go to the next slide, please? The one after that, please. Thank you. So how do we hold the school leaders to account for safeguarding? Now, schools may have put into place various policies. They may have put into place some new processes, new policies to work around the present crisis. As governors, it's really important that we understand and we hold them to account that these new policies, these new processes haven't weakened our existing safeguarding and child protection processes. They would have updated the child protection policies. We need to see that updated child protection policy. We need to show, make sure that it's still fit for purpose. Really important is safeguarding information. Is it up to date? Usually in normal circumstances, schools keep up-to-date records. Is this still happening? Are staff members able to upload any safeguarding concerns they have? How is that happening? As governors, we need to ask this question from DSLs and everybody, or the person concerned, that are these records still being kept up to date? Obviously, because we are working online, does everybody understand about online safety? And really importantly, about working with other agencies. In normal circumstances, schools work with external agencies like MASH, like social services, Is this still continuing? How is the school able to provide information to these external agencies? How are the external agencies communicating back with the school? Now these again will be different, but these communications and this two-way exchange of information does need to continue happening, and we need to ask questions whether this is happening or not. The next thing we should be holding the school leaders to account is the risk assessments. Opening of schools to a wider group of pupils is an operational decision. How the school opens it, how will it manage that opening is operational, but as governors, you need to understand the reasoning behind that operational decision. You need to understand what that operational decision was. Schools would have done risk assessments. That risk assessment should come to the board. Have you had sight of that risk assessment? Have you asked questions to understand how robust this assessment is? Have the risks to children and staff been identified and mitigated? Because schools are in different localities, each locality may have a different health and safety thing to look at. Has the school taken advice from local health and safety teams, and has this advice been considered when they've drawn up their risk assessment? Remote learning, exactly, has remote learning been covered by the risk assessment? And this is really important about specific needs of vulnerable children. There will be children and staff members who will need their own personal risk assessment. Does the board know whether there are any children or any staff members who need a personal risk assessment done for them? Has that been done? So these are the questions we need to hold the school leaders to account for. The next thing is, obviously children are most important, but so are parents as well as staff. And these are times of really stressful, these are stressful times, and therefore communications need to be really clear. They need to be timely, and they need to be appropriate. So as a board, do you know if your school how the school is communicating with the staff, how the school is communicating with parents? Do you know if the school is taking their views into account while while changing the processes? This is vital, and the board needs to have a handle on this as well. I've already mentioned remote learning, so that is again something we need to hold the school leaders to account for. There are various things we need to ask, and we ask the school leaders. For example, do we know what is being put in place for home learning? Now, as governors, it's not my job to tell the school what to teach or how to teach. But it is my job to ask if there is something being done for children who are not attending schools. So what is that happening? How is that happening? Remote learning is all well and good, but do we know that if all pupils are able to access that? If, some people may not have computers or laptops. Have we made any arrangements for that? Even if they have a computer or laptop, they may be sharing it with another family member. They may have restriction of bandwidth or data, etc. So what is happening with those children? Are we sure that nobody is being disadvantaged because you are teaching online now? Staff well-being is our concern as well. As governing boards, do we know if online teaching has added to teacher workload or not? Is that a question we've asked, and do we have the answer for that? Now, I have heard examples of some teachers who've been asked to compile progress data for the spring term and submit this progress data. I've heard examples of line managers saying, if you're having an online lesson, I will be observing you and doing a lesson observation. Now, as governors, if that data comes to you, you must ask them that is that data of any value during this time or not? Or is that data just adding to your teacher workload? So these are some of the questions we need to be asking our school leaders. So this was a quick summary of holding to account. So although there are no progress data or no finance data that you will hold them to account to, but our second core function still continues. And what I'd like us to discuss now is, will accountability change post-COVID, and should it change post-COVID?
Brilliant, thank you, Noreen. I'm going to move colleagues back into your breakout rooms to discuss this question further, and that should happen within the next few seconds. Andy, are you okay? You just need to click on join, that will take you to your group. Brilliant, fantastic. Welcome back, everyone. I'm going to hand back to Noreen to consolidate the conversations for us.
We have feedback from room 1, please.
We can, and Steve is going to provide it on this occasion.
I wondered which room I was in. Thank you very much. Yeah, we covered a range. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
We covered a range of topics. There was a thought that sometimes the governing body regarded risk, or when talking to the senior team about risk, looked for reassurance and a sort of a comfort blanket that everything was being done properly. That has moved on. The risk we are facing at the moment in schools with the virus is extreme, and therefore we need to look at that again. Attitude to risk and making sure that the governors are involved with the senior team in looking at well-being is critical because of the need to spread that well-being through both staff as well as the students. Did the governors agree to school opening was one of the questions that was asked. Certainly in the case of the governing body that I serve on, yes, it did. There has been a broader community engagement from some of the larger schools. That's manifested itself in terms of perhaps food parcels or making sure that those children in most need were looked after. Again, in the school where I'm a governor, some parents have made life extremely difficult for the staff and the head teacher, and it was important that the head was able to come to the governing body and tell us that without naming any names. And finally, there was the thought that actually the more you challenge, sometimes the more support you're giving to your school. That's us.
Thank you. That's good points there. Room 2, please.
I'd love to say something, but I only missed half the conversation, unfortunately. So I have to pass over to Ian or Claire.
Well, we had a few different thoughts, really. Claire shared her plans for doing some training with some people in the near future about trying to get governance back to normal. So that seems quite apt at the moment, and I suppose suggests that what we've been doing currently perhaps isn't going to last. I thought that it was very interesting that the way the governance has gone with this kind of focus on support and being a little less challenge over these very challenging times, I think is interesting, because generally speaking in education, when things are challenging, we do more scrutiny. So if you imagine being in an inadequate school, it's not like anyone's going to say they're going to pull back on the inspections and so on and accountability just because you've got a lot on your plate. We actually do the opposite. We tend to leave the outstanding schools to their own devices a bit more. So I think it's interesting the way things have gone at the moment. And Fee was talking about her experiences as a local governor and how she worries that with things being so focused on the core stuff at the moment, that has led to a reduced role for the local governors, and she's worried that sets a bit of a precedence for the future.
Thank you. Would anybody like to give the feedback from my room, please? Andy, would you?
Yes, I'm muted there.
Sorry to be on this one.
Okay, I didn't take any notes, but we talked about accountability remaining the same, but the focus of accountability changes post-COVID. There are issues about IT poverty. The Sutton Trust, for instance, discussed access for IT from lower socioeconomic pupils from lower socioeconomic background, not necessarily in terms of access to IT, but in terms of parental support. So I think my own view is like mentoring and so on might need additional focus for governors. Were there any other points that Noreen there that we missed?
I think somebody said we will need to be flexible but nimble.
Right, yes.
Yes. yeah, yeah. The main thing was accountability stays. The focus may change.
But the book change,
yeah.
yes. And should it? Well, yes, very definitely. It's going to be a different world out there, and we talked about in September. Obviously, schools won't back; it'll be phased, and then will it change? I mean, there could be issues occur, other spikes in COVID, so we might be back at school and then not back at school. Certainly in FE, a number of our courses we know now are going to be taught remotely until January. So, you know, for governors, that's
come in there about Andy's point about the focus of governance. But one thing we could do is, what are the lessons to be learned from a strategic point of view, given the experience, and then to ensure that you know, where there have been issues, whether it's about accountability, whether it's about access, equitable education. So is the board learning, is there any evidence of the board learning lessons, collecting information and experiences for future, you know, future calamities from a strategic point of view?
Thank you. Can we go to room 4 now, please?
Yes, we had a really interesting conversation around how the structures have changed, particularly in the FE sector. And it sounds to those of us who've been in schools for quite a long while that they're perhaps more coming along into line with the way in which things happen in schools to do with restructures and rebrokering. So we talked about the fact that there are big national funding risks now, particularly for colleges. There was stuff on the radio this morning on apprenticeships, for example. And we talked about the whole way in which that perhaps changes, not just the relationships, but the different types of approaches that school governing bodies, college governing bodies can take. So we were talking around democratic localism, and Jan talked about some research which I haven't come across. Might be good if she managed to share it with Lizana and Lizana dished it out, but a lot of you may be familiar with it, based in Chicago, where they were actually giving opportunities for governance back to parents, back to local communities, and reinvigorating local communities that way. And I could think of a couple of communities who would really appreciate that sort of local invigoration. So I thought that was quite interesting.
Thank you. I think that's it, isn't it, Lizana? Shall I hand it back?
I think we have room 5 still to go.
Room 5. Yeah, sorry. Room 5, please.
Alex, you haven't led a discussion yet. Alex, would you like to feed back on this one?
Yeah, sure. We likewise thought that the accountability is still there. Nothing changes in that respect. We talked about the fact that many schools are open, actually, and so the process of governance has to remain, and schools are being held to account. And then I talked a little about performance management, because I think our first speaker spoke about the fact that's on hold. It's not on hold at all. There might be no progress measures and accountability measures in terms of the government. And although you wouldn't hold a teacher to account for particular things around data, performance management is certainly an aspect of all schools at the moment for teachers.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks for sharing. Thanks, Noreen, for hosting. I'm also delighted to hand over then to our final speaker, Dr. Deborah Outwhite, who will be talking to us about advice on effective governance at a time of crisis. Deb, you are in charge.
Apologies, everybody. My unmute button didn't seem to want to come off. And I have no idea why it's not. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can. Do you want me to share?
Yeah, For some reason, they are not coming up. Thanks, Lizana. We had practice run through everybody as well. Nobody had any problems when we had a practice run through.
These things happen.
So I haven't presented to the Governance and Governing Rig before. Hello, good evening, everybody. If you don't know me, my name's Deb Outhwaite. My role is running a Teaching School Alliance in Derby City and Derbyshire. Lizana, do you need me to press stop share?
That's okay, I've taken over.
Fine, that's good. So as part of my teaching school role, I also run a Derby and Derbyshire governance partnership. So I work with the NLGs locally to secure the different things that we provide. So the whole package, so support. We work very closely with the NGA. They do termly briefings, for example. And I have been a governor in a primary school since I was at university, which is further along ago now than I care to remember. And I was involved in a governance training session just before, a couple of weeks before lockdown. And I was sat with a chap who was older than me, but not by much, and he was talking about his sort of more than 40 years of governance. And I was sort of saying, how have you managed that? And he included his school council experience, so student council experience, and that sort of inducting people into governing bodies. There was an interesting comment earlier on in the chat about the way in which people could understand governance structures, and I think that's really important actually for us to think about when we think about governance in a time of crisis. How well do these governors know their roles? And Julia posted a comment up earlier on saying they don't always know and understand these roles at all. And so if we work with people right at the beginning of the system, we work with our trainee teachers and our newly qualified teachers, we talk to them about governance, we share the NGA information with them. I've even started sharing some of the CST stuff with them to show them how the different structures work in the system. Do you want to move forward for me, Lizana? Thank you. So that's my personal history of governance. I sit on 2 multi-academy trust boards at the moment. I look at this evening's session. I want to talk about the expectations we have in the system and the differences we have in the system overall, and how we use all those resources that are out there, and how we think about defining really what's important, not just for you as a rig moving forward, but also just to capture the amount of different approaches that have been happening clearly in governing bodies. And I've seen that across my own commitments, but obviously working with the range of governors that I work with, it's really fascinating to see and hear the different roles. And I can put you in touch with the NGA, Alex. I've just seen your message flash up there, so we have good connections with them, so I can do that. Do you want to move forward, Lizana? I'm used to navigating my own slides, everybody. Thank you very much. So I've talked about the student council role, being a governor at university. I've been a primary MAT trustee for quite a long while now. We set up a multi-academy trust. And that's a very different role, as you all know, in balancing your own governing roles to the role I had in a big secondary school until last September. But I also have experience on HE panels too, and as a Belmas trustee, of course, incoming vice chair from this summer. But also in my role running a CEO, they are very different governance roles. If you want to move forward, Lizana. So the sort of thing I really want us to think about are the expectations that there currently are in the system. I think for me, the crisis has really played out the differences in the variations between multi-academy trusts and local authorities. So we had a joint RIG meeting with the Leadership Preparation and Development RIG that I co-convene with Structural Reform last November, and we had Sarah Bubb and her team from the IOE come and talk to us about the middle tier. But I've put the middle tier link in my references of this at the end, because I think it's really important that as governors and active governors in the system, we all understand what the middle tier currently is and currently looks like, and how that middle tier is so diverse and the costs associated with it. So at the moment we're running that dual system, and that's what that Barb research is all about. It's really important that everybody really understands that. But I think on top of that, you've got all the very much local levels. We've had lots of different parental expectations through this. We've had lots of state schools who've been told, you know, look, schools down the road, i.e. independent schools, who have to justify their fees to parents when schools are not open. But independent schools are doing this, and you're not even managing to do, you know, X, Y, Z. And I think that there are really interesting ranges of those parental expectations. We know we always have a wide range of parental expectations. But as the pressure comes on to get people back into routines, particularly to get women back into paid work over the next few months, there will really be greater parental expectations. And we know that lots of our heads have really suffered from those, you know, as Derek mentioned, very different pressures that people have and head teachers have had recently. So the governmental advice, we know, has been very difficult and very challenging in schools. It's taken a long while to process that information. And I think there's been a big gap there to parents, even though it's been put out in the public domain at the same time. I think it's been really difficult in the ways that's been communicated. And the government advice is very different, so very much economic led. And we've had those big discussions, haven't we, about how that meets or doesn't meet our public health needs. Anybody who saw the front of the page of The Guardian last Saturday, where it was talking about the different drops in the economy and the drop of 20% in April, based on April to April last year, you know, we're all well aware now of the impact this is going to have on our wider economy. So we know, and we talked about, Noreen talked about earlier on, that duty of care for staff and students and the safekeeping that we have around that. I particularly think we are going to be changing the way in which we deal with the idea of safeguarding staff through some of this. I think staff needs have been very well met in some schools and checked up on by some, in a very supportive way, by some governing bodies. And I think that's one of the really good things perhaps that will come out of this. Hope to move on for me, Lizana, please. So the big differences then are the flexibilities clearly in some of the multi-academy trusts. I am very fortunate in the multi-academy trust where I'm vice chair of trustees. We were very early on with the idea of the recovery programme, and as a consequence we were named in every national newspaper in half-term week, because we've been prioritising this as an issue. And that's because we, you know, sat down very early on and thought about what we needed to do. Chris was talking in the chat earlier on about the essence of continual planning. You know, you don't just plan for one thing, you permanently plan. And in a crisis where you don't know what's coming at you next, you know, particularly in a country that's been, you know, very badly hit by this, we're still, what, the third, fourth worst national statistics on this globally. So I think there's been a huge variance in how some multi-academy trusts have moved their way through different things. And the idea that as a trust, the accountability is very much there as the employer, and looking to what the local authority are doing and giving guidance on in that area, I think is really fascinating. So we know that local authorities have been actively run down by government in the last 10 years, and yet suddenly you have a crisis like this, and key bits of resources. I mentioned in the chat earlier on that I work in a city where we needed to get out 1,700 laptops to students who had no access to online learning. So, I mean, it's a tough ask for local authorities to do that when they've been progressively attacked, progressively run down, and that infrastructure is not there. So huge variance in that LA support and the state of the LA to deal with those pressures. But also think about those wider links that local authorities have into public health England. Lots of issues have reached me about the fact that local authorities have managed to get laptops out, but the dongles haven't gone with them. So the laptops have gone, but the internet access hasn't gone, and the impact that that's had on student learning. And I think, you know, the media are very focused at the moment, and all governors have on their radar, the issue of equitable education. But again, it was raised in the chat earlier on, and Abdullah raised a really good point about that. But this really highlights the fact that we don't have an equitable education system. We have huge disparity in education across the country, and we have huge disparity in how well progressed through different levels of governance are at MAT board level with local governing bodies where they work because they've been in existence a long while, and in areas of the country where that's been resisted. So what they actually look like still very much in their early days, and some really big geographical differences there too. If you want to move on for me, Lizana, thank you. So advice on effective governance in a time of crisis is really tricky because you're all experienced governors yourselves. But for me, it's about that wealth of resource that's out there. So supporting our staff, first of all, and where does their support and their resource come from? So we've already talked about the NGA. They've done some great weekly bulletins through this that have been really accessible, really kind of short, given the amount of government guidance, very punchy. Lots of MAT CEOs now rely on forum education, and lots of MAT trusts now very much relying on the Confederation of School Trusts. And I think Laura Cruddas, if there's one person who's really made the best of a crisis, her briefings have been very invaluable to people who've had access to them, and people have tried to get those out to a very wide field, and very interesting, the links there between with the DFE and who the DFE are listening to in all of this. Same with the briefings with ASCL regularly. So ASCL and the NGA have been doing joint briefings, which I think have been interesting. 2 of those have just come out today as well. And the NAHT got into trouble for doing that joint briefing statement very early on, of course, with the BMA. And I thought that was interesting, the sort of furore that came from that. So there is a lot of informed CPLD out there for governors who've got the time to take it on. But I think also there's an issue that needs to be discussed around governance and governors being the largest sector of volunteer workforce that we have. And if you look at what everybody's done in the last 3 months, taken their jobs online, taken them in-house. Lots of people become governors when they have children in schools. These are people who are also homeschooling at the same time. There are an awful lot of things there in terms of understanding our catchment issues and what particular catchment issues may be. And Noreen talked about safeguarding very well earlier on. Diversity, we cannot have a session this evening that doesn't mention diversity with our international backdrop that we've had. And I think as governors, we know that's always been really important, but actually it's more than just being important. It's actually about how we show that visibility. We've used the work that's available from the NCVO for that. Trusts are voluntary organisations. Trusts can choose whether or not they subscribe to voluntary organisations. Schools can also look, of course, at the work that local authorities have done around diversity too. So I think that's an important area for us. Next one, Lizana, please. So defining what's important, we talked earlier on in my breakout room about being congruent with values. But I think it is really important when we think about schools going back in September, and clearly now we're down to 1 metre plus. It looks like schools are going back in September unless we get a big second spike. But actually understanding that economic imperative is also really important. We talked about the whole issue, the diversity issue, and how we've got systemic inequalities with race. But the demands that have been placed on women through this really highlight the systemic inequalities that there are. And I think we can see that there are very different learning curves that take place through primary and through secondary. So teenage children, once they're 11, largely they have a door key, they do most of their own learning independently, and parents and governors and school staff check up on that. Clearly it's very different with under 11s, and the nature of what schools used for, I think, is really important. we talked about support tonight. We've talked about what critical friendship looks like. And I think it's really important that we support our leaders. You know, those MAT CEO roles particularly, they are very, very lonely places. Headship roles are often very lonely places. And if people were in the middle of setting up federations, setting up multi-academy trusts, you know, dealing with any form of new normal as we went into COVID, which lots of our education leaders were across the system, you're suddenly thrown all these different curveballs. So I think it's really important, yes, the governing body is the challenge, and we've talked about that this evening, but actually we have to think about when the right time is for that challenge. We have to work with those staff who we really need to support. You know, I've just been on a headship panel last week, an online headship panel where we were recruiting a new head into one of our schools. So there are difficult things, you know, those people are starting difficult roles. And as Chris said earlier on, you know, the response you get out of an online session is very different if that person is known to you and you've already built that investment in that personal relationship. You know, people starting, I'm working with 3 primary heads who all started at Easter. You know, clearly their experience of headship is vastly different to the heads that started last Easter. You know, so there are huge things there, I think, about when the time is right for challenge and for us to challenge. So to move on for me, Lizana, please. Thank you. So my discussion question then for your breakout rooms, I think we are going to be in this potential crisis state for a time to come yet. We have all sorts of ensuing pandemic effects that I've touched on. So we've talked about our misschooling, we've talked about issues with vulnerable groups, we've talked about the recession. Is it a recession? Is it a depression? My view is actually it's a depression. It's equivalent to 1930s. It's not equivalent to the 1990s when I graduated and came into teaching. And I did that through choice. My mum and my gran were teachers, but actually, you know, there were lots of people on my PGCE who didn't do it through choice, who did it because there were no economic alternatives in 1994. But we have a potential second wave, another spike potentially on the way, and the focus of governance may need to shift through that. So I think my question is, who are you going to concentrate your focus on in the autumn term? And we've talked about vulnerable communities, we've talked about whether or not that's equitable education. We've talked about what the needs are to get reception in year 1 children back in, because clearly they're the most time consuming, the economic imperative in that. Loneliness of head teacher role, the importance of that chair of trustees, you know, really sharing everything back on the decision making. So there's a lot in there, and I want you to have a think about where your focus is going to be. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Deb. I will be doing the breakout room shift in about 15 seconds. So if you could click on your link as it arrives, it will take you to a breakout room. It will be a slightly shorter conversation, and then we'll move it forward. 5 seconds, Ron.
We're back, yeah.
Now we're back. 1 second.
Are you going to
Okay.
hand over to me afterwards then, and I'll finish?
I'm happy for you to wrap up if you like.
Fine.
With Deb, that's fine.
Yeah.
Seems like everyone's in the room, Ron. Welcome back, everyone. I'm going to hand over to Deb and Ron to facilitate the conversation.
So just do a very quick roundup, Ron, through the rooms, or do you want to axe that because we're running time short?
No, quick roundup, I think we'll do. Yeah.
Quick roundup. Okay, could we go to room 1 then? Break out room 1. Tell us what you were discussing, please.
Okay, well, I think we have answers for all 3 sectors. So for school, and the assumption is that relationships with senior staff survived. So on that assumption, for schools, I think focus was to think about the different approaches to learning that are now going to have to be considered, and for governors to put their minds and their interests towards that. For FE, it's probably financial viability and going concernedness, and similarly HE, financial health, going concern, and the notion of blended learning within HE. So there we go.
Group 2, thank you for that, Ron. Group 2.
For us, it's about taking the time to learn the lessons of what went well and what didn't go well, really, and the focus on the curriculum, on that recovery and resilience conversation, because COVID will end. So that sums up what we were talking about.
Yeah, I think that's right, Fee. I think lots of people have that as their focus. And group 3. Don't want to pick on anybody.
We talked about having to be adaptable and building resilience, but post-COVID, having to go back and to ask for data, though that data may be slightly different, and we won't have a framework of how to examine that data. But eventually we will have to go back at looking at performance data, etc. But resilience came up, building resilience and being adaptable to the changing landscape.
Yes, that's very similar to what our group 4 spoke about. Jan, do you want to have just a minute on what we spoke about in group 4?
We talked a little bit about trauma and being able to support both pupils and teachers who are coming back from a very challenging situation. And we're spending a lot of time on trauma training, as it were, and signposting. And we also talked about being on it, all over it, and knowing when to do the right thing at the right time, really. That's about it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And group 5, don't want to forget you.
We just had, we need to look after the staff, particularly our new teachers, because they will have had an amazingly shocking experience, to actually use the window of opportunity that's been presented to us, and really find out what the children are coming back with before we start marching into testing.
Yeah. Can I just add that, I mean, that's exactly right, Julia, thanks. Can I just add that, as coming out of any kind of crisis, there is an opportunity to do things differently, and I just kind of thinking, how might we do this differently? I haven't got any ideas, but, just opening up that space. Let's stop and think, right, what's this do to us? What new era are we in? How might we do things differently? I don't know, but yeah, interesting times.
So a couple of things about that. The all-party parliamentary group for the teaching profession have been talking about what we do differently and published some documents on what we do differently. And just thinking, Julia, about your comment, as governors, please have on your radar that the government are funding the early career teacher framework for an additional 3,000 places outside the Northwest. So I'm responsible for handing out funding for that for 50 of those places where I am. Derbyshire have another 50. But ask in your governing bodies, is there any funded places around for early career teachers in this area? So those PGCEs that were cut short this year, those NQTs need that support. We need to get the early career teacher framework properly in place. You know, if we don't ask those questions as governors and trustees, then people miss out on that funding. Ron, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So just finally, as we're getting towards 8 o'clock, one final item to bring to your attention, that there will be a special edition. There will be a special edition of Management and Education devoted to governance. And the focus of that is going to be exploring how educational governance has evolved in England over the past decade, with particular reference to academies and multi-academy trusts, and how governance needs to continue to evolve in the changing landscape of education. There's also international contributions welcomed on that topic, and the guest editorial team has identified a selection of key topics. I'm sure you can think of some yourselves here, but examples of topics might well be ethical governance, the notion of reimagining multi-academy trusts, academies, free schools for the future, status of trustees, members, those governing at local level, governance and diversity, governance and leadership, governance with technology, or governing with technology. And so that's moving forward, and submission of proposals are requested by the 31st of July, and those are to go to Lizana. Lizana, is there anything else you'd like to add on that?
No, I absolutely love the point you added there in terms of governance with technology, and also thinking about technology. That's a really great point to add to that as well. Thank you, Ron.
Okay. Well,
sorry, this will also go out in a paper form to members as well.
So, just to bring things to an end then, thank you for very lively and entertaining. So thanks to our presenters for their stimulating. Thank you for attending and participating. I think we've gained considerable insight into recent governing practice, and we'll try and share that with a wider audience within Belmas and beyond. So to confirm, your new research interest group, governance and governing and education convener, is with effect from tomorrow, is Lizana. Best of luck to you. And thank you all very much for joining the meeting.
No, whoa, stop, Ron.
I'm going to stop him too.
Who's going to stop him? I mean, we're all going to stop him. I don't care if it's recorded or not. Who wants to say it? Go on, Deb.
AOB, yeah.
Very many thanks, Ron, for all the years of RIG convening. You know, everybody thinks these research interest groups just happen, and they don't. And I know they don't, because I co-convene one myself. So the length of time that you have done, and some of the some of the publications that have come from it, and the discussion and engaging, you know, like you have tonight, with governors doing the role. It's really, really valuable thing. It's one of the really great things that Belmas does. Thank you very much.
That's a pleasure.
Well said, Deb. Just to echo that, I mean, it's been well organised and nicely done with plenty of humour. It's been a great, you made it a great group to be in, and that will continue, I know, with under the new guidance of the team. So really good. Thanks, Ron.
Thank you very much. And I noticed your comments as well. Thank you. Thank you. So with that said, away we go. Particularly at this time, cheerio for now. See you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ron.
Bye, Ron. Great to see you.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you, Ron.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Craig. Thank you.